We're joined today by Advocate Steve Swart, representing the African Christian Democratic Party, and Mr. Brandon Pillay, representing the African National Congress. And we're here to discuss electoral reform in general, and in particular, the Electoral Act Amendment Bill that is going through Parliament at the moment. One of the main reasons for it, of course, was the Constitutional Court decision that has required an amendment to allow independent candidates to stand for election in national and provincial elections. The amendment bill has been somewhat controversial, and a number of civil society organizations have objected to the bill in the form that it was finally adopted by the National Assembly, as did a number of opposition parties. So in this webinar, we have asked Mr. Brandon Pillay to give us the governing party's point of view, and Advocate Steve Swart to give us more or less the opposition party's point of view. We hope also to be joined later by a spokesperson for the Civil Society Coalition that also made a number of inputs. So we will start by hearing from Brandon Pillay. Brandon, over to you.
Good day, Mike, and all other participants and everyone that's on this platform. Firstly, let me thank the organizers for the opportunity to have a robust engagement and to be part of this process today. Thank you very much. I think what is important for me to start off with is democracy. It's a term drawn from two Greek words meaning rule by the people. It differs from other forms of government in its insistence that in principle, every adult has a right to say in decisions. Democracy is therefore a system in which people rule by electing representatives into public office and the people to govern. Elected public representatives carry out the will of the people. It is for this reason that 67 years ago in Kliptown, thousands of people adopted the Freedom Charter, which proclaimed that people shall govern. The Constitutional Court in the New Nation Movement judgment declared that provisions of the Electoral Act of 1998, which prevent independent candidates from competing in provincial and national elections, unconstitutional. The court ruled that the impugned provisions violated independent candidates' constitutional rights to stand for public office and to freedom of association and to dignity. The court felt strengthened in this conclusion by its analysis of the right to freedom of association. In this instance, in the court's view, the court content of the right is one of an individual choice, the right to choose to associate or disassociate. It considered the constitutional purpose of freedom of association and its treatment in international and foreign law, and concluded that Section 18 of the Constitution protects not only the positive right to associate, but also the negative right not to be compelled to associate. The court thus held that the right to freedom of association is limited when the state compels individuals to associate with a political party against their will, whether by joining or forming a party. The Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state, founded inter alia on the value of a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. The ANC has been and remains committed to these foundational principles. In the years immediately preceding the formal negotiations to end apartheid rule, ANC delegations had engaged members of the white minority establishment in our country in a vigorous discussion about the real meaning of the objective stated in the Freedom Charter as the people shall govern. And the ANC insisted that this was truly committed to the view that the people shall govern through a truly democratic system of government. We cannot lose sight of the history of our country. After decades of disenfranchisement of the Black majority in South Africa, the ANC declared that the achievement of the right to vote would signal the achievement of full citizenship and legal equality for all. it declared that elections would be a fundamental element of a democratic political life in our country, and that government shall maximize popular participation and be accountable and responsible to the people. As the ANC, we have always supported a proportional representation system, as it is best suited to a country as diverse as ours in terms of race, class, and language. The system ensures that different political viewpoints are able to have or find representation in parliament and speak on behalf of that constituency. Now, on the 11th of June 2020, the matter of the New Nation movement and others versus the President of the Republic of South Africa and others, the Constitutional Court declared the Electoral Act 73 of 1998 to be unconstitutional, insofar as it requires that adult citizens be elected to the National Assembly and provincial legislatures only through their membership of political parties. The declaration of unconstitutionality was held to be prospective from 11 June 2020. Its operation was suspended for 24 months to allow Parliament to remedy the defect giving rise to the unconstitutionality. It was envisaged that the defect would be corrected by 10th June 2022. Now, following briefings by the Independent Electoral Commission and the establishment of and reporting by the Ministerial Advisory Committee, which we refer to as the MAC, on the electoral system, on the 10th of January 2022, the Minister of Home Affairs introduced to Parliament the Electoral Amendment Bill, which was referred to the Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs for processing. The bill, as introduced, broadly proposes to insert certain definitions consequential to the expansion of the Act to include independent candidates as contestants to elections in the National Assembly and provincial legislatures, provide that registered parties must submit a declaration confirming that all their candidates are registered to vote in the region or province where an election will take place, provide for the nomination of independent candidates to contest elections in the National Assembly or provincial legislature, provide for the requirements and qualifications which must be met by persons who wish to be registered as independent candidates, provide the procedure to follow for a non-compliant nomination of an independent candidate, provide for the inspection of copies of lists of independent candidates and accompanying documents, provide for objections to independent candidates, provide for the inclusion of a list of independent candidates entitled to contest elections, provide that independent candidates are bound by the Electoral Code of Conduct, and provide for the return of a deposit to independent candidates in certain circumstances. What I want to draw your attention to is a summary on the final deliberations and decisions that the Electoral Amendment Bill saw. One was contesting in either single or multiple regions, and committee thereafter Parliament had adopted that it will be multiple regions, where an independent candidate will be able to contest in multiple regions to be able to acquire a seat in the National Assembly. The requirements in respect of signatures, where discussions went to and fro from 50% to 30% and later agreed on 20% of the quota of a seat in the previous election. One of the important points that was removed was that of a cooling off period, which the initial bill had opted for. But after deliberations, we had then decided to remove the cooling off period. The bill also accommodates for agents, that is independent candidates having agents as part of what we previously called party agents. It also included a political liaison committee to extend or expand the current political to extend the current party liaison committee. We also then introduced 3 ballots, and that the allocation of seats be done with a single round droop quota. And one of the other important things that was decided on was on the filling of vacancies. Now, the bill was introduced to Parliament on the 21st of January. It was published for public comment. The closing date for such comments was the 21st of February 2022. The committee received 107 written submissions. And on the 1st and 2nd of March, the committee held virtual public hearings. A total of 13 oral submissions were received from the following individuals and organizations: The committee crisscrossed the country and conducted provincial hearings in all 9 provinces from 7th to 23rd March 2022. A total of 3,483 people attended the public hearings and 610 made oral submissions. Of the 610 people who made the oral submissions, 389 had supported the bill in its current form. Due to the extensive public participation process that the committee undertook and the complexity of the bill, the committee foresaw that it was not going to meet the Constitutional Court deadline of the 10th of June 2022 to finalize the processing of the bill. And prior to the expiry of the deadline, Parliament approached the Constitutional Court to request an extension period of 6 months to finalize the bill. The Constitutional Court granted an extension until the 10th of December 2022. In processing the bill, the committee invited the Department of Home Affairs, the Electoral Commission, and the Parliamentary Legal Services to comment on the report on public participation. The committee deliberated on the bill on several occasions and held meetings during the constituency periods in June, July, and October 2022. Following its deliberations, the committee proposed amendments to other sections of the Act, which were not part of the bill, and proposed other material changes to various definitions and clauses in the bill. The committee requested permission from the National Assembly to extend the scope of the bill in this regard. The request was made in terms of the National Assembly Rule 286, 4 subsection B and 4 subsection C on the 30th of August 2022. The National Assembly granted permission to the committee on the 1st of September, and on the 2nd of September 2022, the committee then advertised these proposed amendments and called for further public submissions by the 16th of September. The re-advertisement was to ensure that members of the public would have a chance to comment only on these proposed material amendments to the bill. Now, let me reflect on the ANC's position on independent candidates being allowed to contest elections. As far back as 2007, the ANC has resolved in its national conference that appropriate requirements should be set for persons wishing to contest elections as independent candidates. And so when a challenge was made by a person wishing to stand as an independent, we fully accepted the decision handed on the 11th of June. Importantly to note is that in section 15 of the CC judgment, the Constitutional Court also stated that a lot was said about which electoral system is better, which system better affords the electoral accountability, etc. That it's territory the judgment will not venture into. The pros and cons of this or other systems are best left to Parliament, which in terms of sections 46(1)(a) and 105(1)(a) of the Constitution has the mandate to prescribe on electoral system. I'm going to round up by saying that the only difference that we found in our discussions and deliberations at a parliamentary committee level from the opposition was, one, that the DA felt that independence should be locked to one region only and not multiple regions. Two is that they agreed with a 20% of the signatures. And three, they had a challenge around the allocation of seats and the quota that is being used, particularly in filling of vacancies, where they felt that the formula may disadvantage parties after the allocation of seats were made. The EFF was strong that it needed to be 50% of the signatures and no less than that, and that deposits should actually be the same for both political parties and independents. And the IFP felt that the deposit needed to be much lower and the signatures should be between 10 to 15%. Otherwise, all political parties felt that the current electoral system is the system that we should go to the 2024 elections to, and that this was the system that was best suited for the country at this stage. If there's any other discussions on an overhaul of an electoral system, that process can be undertaken or dealt with after the elections. Unfortunately, having to split the country into constituency-based system for a 2024 election was not going to be possible. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brandon. Right, so you've already told us a little bit about what some of the opposition parties were feeling about it, and I'm going to ask Steve just to go straight into his presentation, tell us the ACDP standpoint, but also feel free to convey some of the other views as well. Steve?
Well, thank you, Mike. And firstly, may I thank you and the Catholic Parliament Liaison Office, as well as the Hans Siedow Foundation for hosting this online discussion. My greetings also to my colleague ANC MP, the Honourable Brendan Pillay, and many friends I see on the platform. Michael Louis, who played a key role in the New Nation case, and Advocate Paul Hoffman, Michael Swain, Daniel Ellerbrick, greetings to you all. So may I just at the outset say this, whilst I attended the initial discussions by the Ministerial Task Team, I'm not a formal member of the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee, but I did participate in the debate, and I'm grateful to Brendan for pointing out some of the issues that the other parties did raise. And I think that I would like to approach this slightly broader as well, and taking a step back. We fully know that what the Constitutional Court found, and Brendan did point that out, but the question is whether Parliament missed the opportunity for more extensive electoral reform. Now, I fully appreciate in the time that was available to Parliament, it is probably not possible, but had the department started earlier, when it was anticipated that electoral reform was in the offing, way back when the High Court made orders in this regard, and way back, you can even take a step back to the discussions that were held in the Fund Sales Slubbert Commission in 2003, where it was suggested a multi-member constituency with proportionality retained. And may I just emphasize from the ACDP's perspective, and in terms of the Constitution, had we not had a proportional system, the ACDP would probably not have elected representatives. So we're very grateful for that. But clearly, over time, there's been a need for electoral reform. And the Fund Sale Commission, I remember meeting with the late Fund Sale Slubbert at that time, 2003, where the principles of fairness, inclusivity, simplicity, and accountability, those were the guiding principles. And we know that sadly very little came of that commission. Then, of course, we had the independent panel assessment of Parliament, which also identified the electoral system as one of the several serious structural weaknesses in the functioning of Parliament. And that was in 2009. That was the Motlanthe independent panel assessment. And it mentioned the absence of a constituency-based electoral system and the top-down effect of the party list system as a major impediment to Parliament's ability to exercise its oversight mandate properly. And we know the deficiencies that have existed in that regard, as pointed out in other Constitutional Court cases, such as the EFF versus the President Zuma at the time. So if we then also look at the Zondo State Capture Report, it's also made important recommendations on electoral reform, and it pointed out that the ravages of the present system in that parliaments failed to call out corruption because they were beholden, in his words, to the parties and not to their voters. And of course, we know he was speaking in particular to the ANC, which had shown, in his view, scant appetite for reform, and we tend to agree with that. So when one then considers the New Nation judgment, considers the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Electoral Reform, which explored a variety of options. I remember attending those sessions with former Minister Vali Musa. And as we know, the Advisory Committee narrowed down the choices to two options, which was formulated as a majority and a minority report. And of course, the majority report proposed a single-member constituencies option with proportionality secured through party lists, similar to what is at local government elections at the local government level. Half the MPs elected directly. So in the case of what the majority proposed, independents would stand as individuals in constituencies and compete together with their associates for the party list vote as well. Now the minority report proposed a slightly modified closed party list multi-member constituency system to accommodate independents in the existing electoral system. And we know the bill accepted recently by the National Assembly followed the minority report's what we would term minimalistic approach, and it has largely ignored previous reports on electoral reform. Now, again, I want to emphasize that Parliament was given very little time. And so I appreciate what Honorable Pillay says, that for a full comprehensive electoral reform to be done in this short period of time was very difficult. But had we engaged on this some time ago, years ago, I think we would have been far further down the road. And I also appreciate what he says about other political parties and their comments on some of the issues that he raised. Now, in our view, the end result seems to be a system which has not been implemented anywhere in the world and has even been met with skepticism even from ANC veterans when it comes to the way that independent candidates have been inserted into the existing framework. So we would, had we have had more time, and I think we're all in agreement with that, we would have preferred far more substantial electoral reform. And I think that the majority report, had there been far much more time, is something that one would have liked to engage with and embrace. So it's interesting that some of the opposition parties that during the debate argued that the bill, which was meant to give effect to constitutional right for independent candidates to stand, in fact, discriminates against those independent candidates because it consigns them to a provincial list by treating provinces as constituencies, almost super constituencies, but excludes them from the proportional representation list system. And so I think that is a major problem. And it seems, my reading of it is that they can only gain a region to a National Assembly seat in one province, and the rest of their votes are then discarded. They cannot make use of those votes. However, they pay the same fee, they submit the same support petitions in every province, and this has the result that an independent could gain enough votes across provinces to gain a seat, but not be awarded a seat for national, if you can, because those seats are gauged at every province. And they're also then banned from contesting 200 of the 400 available seats. And this clearly is unfair. And then what happens then with the fact the extra votes that are cast then go to the party that receives the highest votes in that area. And I don't think that is fair, if I understand that correctly as well. There will be, so when the provincial seats are calculated first, and there's a recalculation process in which voters left over once an independent candidate reaches a required threshold, those votes go to the party that received the most votes. And that means that parties may get more than their proportional share of the seats. And that, in our view, would clearly benefit the ANC, as I understand that. So I think had Lawson Naidoo been here, he holds the view very strongly that MPs should have looked at the municipal system in drafting the bill. And in his view, he's said that parties instead agreed to devise a novel system that contrives provinces as super constituencies for the purposes of national polls and distributes excess votes cast for independent candidates to parties. And that is an issue which is problematic. So let me just continue then. I think when you consider some of the aspects that there's a huge call for voter and electoral reform, one of the biggest concerns for all of us as political parties, and I'm sure the Honorable Pillay will agree, is the decline in voter support. To conclude, I think, Chair, that we have taken note of impassioned pleas from civil society organizations, including Anglican Archbishop Thabo Makgoba. We believe that far more could and should have been done for effecting lasting electoral reform. Clearly, time was against us as Parliament, but I think I'd like to just bear in mind what former Minister Vali Musa and Chairman of the Ministerial Advisory Committee said, that continued parliamentary neglect of meaningful electoral reform is, quote, like a person driving a truck that has fallen asleep at the wheel. Now, we as the ACDP did not support the bill. I appreciate the detail that Honorable some of the issues. And what I also wanted to just emphasize was that at the programming committee recently, the speaker indicated, and this is very important, because of the time constraints and because the Constitutional Court deadline is in December, that should there be amendments that the NCOP proposes, that they might have to be held over till after the 2024 elections, given the fact that we've got this December deadline. So it is regrettable that more extensive electoral reform did not take place, given what's been said over the years. But I'll leave it at that at this stage, and I'd like to engage with members on the panel. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks. I'm sorry, everybody, about those unfortunate interruptions. I've disabled the screen sharing now, so hopefully that will help a bit. But clearly people just joining the meeting for only one purpose, and that is to try to upset us. So we won't allow ourselves to be too upset about that. I want to open it up obviously for discussion. I'm still hoping that Lukhona will be able to join us before we close. But I'd like to ask to start with both Steve and Brandon for their perspectives on this question. Yes, there's a certain groundswell for wider electoral reform, and in particular, as you've described it, moving towards some sort of a hybrid system, perhaps. But was this the correct moment and opportunity? The judgment itself, as Brandon pointed out, did not specifically call for that. Was this the correct moment to sort of launch that attempt, or should this this amendment narrowly have confined itself to satisfying the demands of the judgment? From your point of view, Steve, and then I'll ask Brandon to respond, what's the correct strategy to follow here?
Well, I think if I go back to when the discussions were taking place with former Minister Vali Musa, he said that this was a wonderful opportunity to engage in more broader reform. And that was right way back when the MAC was presenting its findings. So yes, I appreciate practical implications of broader electoral reform would have been difficult given what the Electoral Commission said and their difficulties with timelines. But and I appreciate that the Constitutional Court also was very clear in what it expected. But I would have liked to have seen broader electoral reform, given what Minister Vali Musa said, and given the fact that our turnout of voters is declining significantly. And we are all concerned, we must be concerned about that. And people are crying out for reform, a far deeper electoral reform that hopefully would see a greater sense of legitimacy.
In your response to this question, was this the correct moment to engage in a debate around wider electoral reform?
Mike, I think what is important to note is that, and it's something that I've brought through all of my discussions and debates and deliberations, is that we were addressing the unconstitutionality of this electoral bill or the act. And what the court was asking us to do as Parliament was to include independent candidates to be able to contest both the national and provincial legislatures. Now, the only difference here is that the current local government elections accommodates for we did not have independents being able to contest at a national space. Now, what it was asking us to do was allow them to be able to do that. And I'm still going to say that the court made it clear that they do not have the jurisdiction to be able to change the electoral system, that only Parliament does, and that anything that we do has to be within the Constitution. Now, I want to draw reference to a very important point because it's something that was always mentioned. The Van Zyl Commission in 2003 and the Motlanthe report claiming that it was ignored. Now, both of these reports were actually considered by the MAC, along with many other options. And it was rejected because it did not meet the principles that were set out by the MAC. Now, the MAC had principles that they had set out before they were able to deliberate. But most importantly, that any changes to the electoral system needed to be constitutional, and that didn't. Now, there's also a very important point that I think we must draw cognizance of. And that is the system that we currently have, the current electoral system. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Like I said at the beginning, the only thing that it was not allowing or accommodating for independence. And hence, there was a submission that said, let's allow for the inclusion of independent candidates. The other important point that we must draw comparison to, that if we had to demarcate constituencies in our country, it will not only be highly politicized, but it'll be very time consuming, potentially highly contentious, and fraught with the potential of racial baiting, but incredibly costly. And those that are advocating for constituencies must also recognize that those that are advocating for these constituency-based systems must understand that it'll be very large. In fact, over 250,000 people in each constituency, which is actually going to even be larger than 171 of our local municipalities. So it is going to be very large. And we've not missed the point, like most people want to believe, where we've not engaged in an electoral system. What we said is that we were dealing with what the Constitutional Court asked us to do, and that was to allow for independents to contest. So the electoral system reform that is being asked, and that's where the only contention is, and I'll say it again, that civil society and independents believe that it should be a constituency-based system, and the current electoral system is not allowing for that. And lastly, if you had to understand an independent candidate, it means one person. It means that you can only occupy one seat. So whether you are on a regional seat, whether you are on a provincial legislature, whether you are on a PR list, you are still going to occupy one seat. So either way, you are only going to be able to you're only going to be able to occupy one seat. Now, if you want to occupy more than one seat, it means that you're going to go back to being a collective. And what does that mean? It means that you then have the right to associate or disassociate. So if you want to be a collective or a group or a party, or you want to be independent, that means be one person. That's a point that I think we must draw across.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Fortunately, we have now been joined by our civil society speaker, Lukhona Mnguni. So Lukhona, without any further introductions and all the rest of it, I did introduce you earlier on in your absence. I'm going to ask you to switch on your video, unmute yourself, please, and give us that civil society perspective. We've obviously heard now from governing party, from opposition. Let's hear from civil society. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Great.
Thank you so much, Mike, and my sincere apologies for the mix-up that we had. And I'm now under the pouring skies of the Northwest as we speak. I do want to reflect back on the electoral reform indaba that was hosted by civil society a few months back. And the purpose of that was to develop some consensus in terms of what it is we mean when we talk about electoral reform as civil society, because for some time we were pulling in different directions and not necessarily quite united in terms of interpretation of the bare minimum things that we are looking for. And you know that this is a very long conversation in our democratic dispensation. The issue of electoral reform is not new. What the Constitutional Court did was simply to trigger an official process that would take us towards a legislated change in our electoral system. Unfortunately, it appears that we have missed the boat as a country, and I am saying this because Parliament is still frog marching a bill that is nowhere near the ethos of an electoral system dispensation that accords with the values of our constitution, but also the aspirations of our country. And you can go back as far back as the the Van Zyl Slabbert report. You can go back as far back as the Mutlante high-level panel reviewing legislation and its effectiveness, and of course, recently, the Vali Musa report. And what is not being explained in rational terms by those who support this current bill is why it is that they are scared of fundamental changes to our electoral system as a country. And therefore, civil society feels that society is being robbed of an opportunity to really define a system, one that is closer to people, meaning that we are able to elect individuals that we know as our public representatives, because the current system does not work. You vote for a party, the party decides who goes to parliament, and once they've gone to parliament, they get deployed to a constituency. I'll make you an example. There are people who are from the Eastern Cape and their constituencies are like in Bloemfontein. I mean, they don't know the people there, they don't know the language, they don't know the issues. And therefore, it is almost representatives imposing themselves in communities. That's the first thing. It's not an abstract argument. It's a real argument that gives an opportunity for society to have more robust conversations with their representatives and fight for the issues that come from those localities in parliament. And as a result, the culture that is built in parliament is really a head mentality culture of chief whips, the party position. There's no fighting for constituency-related issues. There's no fighting for sectorial-related issues. We just are under the dictatorship of political parties. That's one of the things that civil society is looking to break, because if we do not do that, we are going to find ourselves with a democracy that is simply for political parties and not for citizens. And that is not fair on society itself. It's understandable that political parties, especially those that support this bill, would want to self-preserve through a system that dominates and predominantly disproportionately support political parties. And so that's the first issue. It's the proximity of public representatives to the locals. The second one is driving agendas of accountability. Now, of course, in the Van Zyl Slabbert report, in the Vali Musa Ministerial Advisory Committee report, there is appreciation that indeed you cannot guarantee accountability from an electoral system. Yes, we accept that. But there are electoral systems that have potential to foster some degrees of accountability, in the sense that a constituency may just simply choose not to vote into office again a public representative who has not been accountable, who has been distant and all of that. Currently, political parties, we are at the mercy of them. They can recycle inefficient parliamentarians and actually discard efficient parliamentarians. We've seen parliamentarians who have done a lot of accountability work not being returned to parliament by their own organizations. But as a public, we do not have the influence to say, but we like that public representative because they're actually doing a good job. They chaired the ad hoc committee into Transnet and ESCOM, and we really, really appreciate the work that they've done, and they should return. No, the political party can simply amputate those it finds are a nuisance to its agenda of a head mentality approach. This is problematic because you've got 400 members of parliament that are being paid by you've got 400 members of parliament who are paid by the state, but the manner in which they operate is not rooted in the logic that they are public representatives. It is mostly rooted in the idea that they are sent there to carry out a party mandate, not a state mandate. Now, we can go back to the Constitutional Court judgment of August 20. Issue of the secret ballot was tabled before the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court spelled out exactly the commitment that members should have to their oath of office and not to their political party. And when that judgment came out, some of us said the biggest challenge is for political parties to change their constitutions so that their public representatives are not merely just removed at the whim of the political party simply because they stood up for their oath of office in parliament. Now, this is a step in the right direction to call for an electoral system that has a constituency-based element so that members of parliament can feel that their seat belongs more to the constituency rather than to the political party. And this is what we saw. I'll make an example. In Maluti Apufong, councillors wanted to change a mayor who was seen to be corrupt and not doing his job. The party decided to defend the mayor and expel the councillors. But because those councillors had credibility in their communities, even outside of the ANC banner, they could still stand, and that's why they are now leading that municipality in a coalition government. Because there is a system at local government that allows citizens to really align with the type of public representatives they believe are deserving of their votes. So this is not a call for minimal, insertion, as the minister sometimes call it, of independent candidates. Unfortunately, what we now have is a bill that, one, is extremely unfair. So anyway, the Constitutional Court will still have to judge this bill for its fairness, for the ease for independent candidates to participate, and for its rationality. Now, we have heard that, there would be difficulty if we were to demarcate and so on. I don't think we must be trying to solve for difficulty, because the truth of it is that the design of this bill is going to create problems where independent candidates are said to contest with political parties. That is already an unfair contestation, because I'm contesting for one seat versus somebody who's potentially contesting all 200, all 400 seats in the National Assembly. Therein lies already the problem of unfairness. Secondly, there's no ease of participation for independent candidates, because the nature of an independent candidate is that they're an individual. But if you are in KwaZulu-Natal and you expect an independent candidate to contest for votes in Kokstad as much as they contest for votes in Mangus or in Umhlabuyalingana, it's an irrational expectation, because you now turn the independent candidate away from being an individual to being a political party of one person versus political parties of thousands of members with foot soldiers across the board. So the point I'm really making here is that there is no rationality in that logic of making a province a constituency, because you put up the burden on the independent candidate in an unequal footing with political parties for them to contest. And the right to equality in our constitution is vastly important. And secondly, the equality of the vote and the value of the vote is also important, because now those who vote for an independent candidate versus those who vote for political parties, the value of their votes is no longer the same, because those who vote for political parties are contributing to a wider pot that influences the shape of more seats than those who vote for one person who you can only occupy one seat. And then, of course, there are the other problems that civil society has been pointing to, the work of people like Michael Atkins around the question of numbers, which he begins to demonstrate to us that a vote for an independent candidate automatically accrues value to some of the bigger political parties by mere effect of the fact that if an independent candidate were to get 200,000 votes and they only need 50,000 to occupy the seat, the other 150,000 votes, which could have translated into 3 seats, and yes, an independent can only occupy 1 seat, but what you do is you distort the feelings of the electorate, because that 150,000, when you now calculate the seats, has to accrue to some of the political parties, because the independent candidate can't even, have a share on the remainder seats and all of these things. So then the outcomes of political parties get inflated by the success of an independent candidate. Again, there's a question there that misses the constitutional imperative that our electoral systems by nature must result in a system that has proportionality in it. So the resistance to the call by civil society, by some political parties, is in our view unconstitutional and undemocratic. And it should be resisted, and it will be resisted. And that is why civil society in the last few days has begun a targeted campaign to the president, to say to the president, don't sign that bill, and particularly because the president has now sent his implementation report of the Zondo Commission report to Parliament. And in there, he alludes to the issue of electoral reforms, and that the Zondo Commission has as one of its recommendations the issue of a constituency-based election complemented by a proportional representation list of parties. Now, he made a commitment when addressing the country to say he will check this bill if it meets some of these conditions by the Zondo Commission. Now, parliamentarians can't ignore that call from the president. They can't ignore the reality that here sits a body of evidence over 2 decades that there was an understanding that the current system is a temporal arrangement, it's a transitional arrangement, and it's not permanent. But there is falsification that we must stick to the letter of what the Constitutional Court has said. No, parliamentarians don't exist to implement Constitutional Court judgments. They exist to implement calls by society because they are our public representatives. But herein lies the problem. These current parliamentarians are not our representatives. They are representatives of their political parties. That's why they don't think that they can engage us. That's why they can even think of insulting civil society when they disagree with civil society. They send disparaging messages. They mock us. They vilify us. That is sheer lack of understanding of what parliament is and its role in listening to society, not scripting society. I went to a public participation on this bill in Hammanskraal. The ANC and the EFF had bussed people and scripted them, and they just read the same thing. I mean, that is actually dumbing down the conversation in society. That's not public participation. That is just simply thinking that public participation is about how many people say the same thing. No, public participation is about the testing of ideas and allowing the ideas that are most constitutional, most robust, most progressive, and most committed to our constitution to thrive and to take our society forward. The truth of the matter is that their parliamentarians can behave this way because they know that there's nothing we can do to them. They are untouchable. They are protected by their political parties. And if they don't toe the political party line, they are at the danger of losing out on their own seats. There is no way that all these people from civil society, religious bodies, constitutional experts, and legal centers are mad in their contributions around this bill. There is absolutely no way. What is currently happening now is that parliamentarians who support this bill are walking away from society. And we have said as civil society, we will encourage society to walk away from them in 2024 because they are fiddling with something that is so crucial, so cardinal to our liberation struggle, the right to franchise, one person, one vote of equal value. This is the
Lukhona, can I interrupt you at that point? We need to watch the time. I want to put one quick question to you. What do you say to the argument that says, yes, everything you say is very, very true, and we must reform the system, but we have roughly between now and the 2024 elections about 1.5 years, and logistically, administratively, it's not possible to do it before those elections. Therefore, we should make a commitment to reopening this conversation after the 2024 elections. What is your response to that argument?
Civil society did not create this mess. Civil society did not bring South Africa to the brink of risking 2024 elections. It's the parliamentarians that have done that by not fulfilling their duties mandated by the Constitutional Court to conclude this process within 2 years. There was an entire year that was spent doing nothing. This is not a problem for civil society to resolve. What civil society will fight for is the most constitutional outcome. We can then go and discuss compromises and get guidance from the Constitutional Court in terms of what is practical, what is logistically possible, but we cannot be put in a position to accept blame for that. Now it will be civil society that risks 2024 elections. No, we must put it across as truly and thoroughly as it is. Parliament, once again, was sleepwalking deliberately to try and frustrate this process. And they're not going to meet the December 10 deadline. I can bet you now. They're going to go and ask for another extension of the deadline. So who's actually at fault here? It's Parliament. And the question that society needs to ask is, what are we going to do about that? Because we cannot continue with a Parliament that behaves in this way, a Parliament that gave us state capture, a Parliament that gave us Nkandla. We cannot continue in this way. That's the view of civil society.